"We triumphed by eliminating the unnecessary employees who held us back," Jason proclaimed from the stage, his voice resonating throughout the conference hall. The audience erupted into applause as cameras flashed around him. I sat motionless at table 12, witnessing our major launch event morph into my public downfall. The irony was not lost on me. After 14 years of maintaining this company's compliance and profitability, I was being labeled as dead weight. My name is Denise Holloway, and I'm 52 years old. For more than a decade, I served as the Chief Financial Officer at Virepoint Dynamics, a medium-sized manufacturing firm based in Portland, Oregon. While others pursued headlines and fame, I operated behind the scenes, ensuring our financials were accurate, our partnerships were robust, and our compliance was impeccable. I wasn't the type to deliver flashy presentations or network at events. I was the person who ensured the numbers added up and our legal documents were foolproof. However, that evidently wasn't sufficient for Jason Wexler, our new CEO, who had arrived 6 months ago with assurances of modernization and growth. From the outset, he made it clear that my careful tactics did not align with his vision for a dynamic, forward-thinking organization. He sought yes-men who would rubber-stamp his aggressive expansion strategies, not someone who posed uncomfortable questions about inflated projections and dubious vendor contracts. As I watched Jason revel in the spotlight, portraying our latest product line as groundbreaking, I couldn't help but reflect on the unsigned audit report sitting in my office safe, the one that outlined discrepancies I had discovered just the previous week. I had refused to certify it until the irregularities were addressed, but Jason dismissed my worries, insisting we could tidy up the details later. I knew better. I had dedicated my entire career to building a reputation for integrity, and I wasn't about to jeopardize it. Meanwhile, the audience hung on Jason's every word as he depicted a vision of unmatched success and boundless potential. Investors nodded in approval, their checkbooks practically visible in their eyes. I noticed several board members scattered throughout the crowd, all wearing satisfied grins, completely unaware of the turmoil brewing behind the scenes. Security guards began making their way through the audience, their destination obvious. I had anticipated this moment ever since Jason summoned me into his office that morning to deliver the news with his typical smirk. "Your services are no longer needed, Denise. We're heading in a different direction." He had timed my termination perfectly, right before our most significant event, ensuring maximum humiliation. As the guards approached my table, I stood up calmly and reached for the black folder I had prepared. Something told me that this evening was not going to unfold as Jason intended. Looking back, I should have noticed the warning signs months prior. Jason had joined Virepoint Dynamics amid much fanfare, recruited by our board after our previous CEO announced his retirement. Industry publications hailed him as a visionary leader who had transformed his last company from a regional player into a national powerhouse, conveniently omitting that he had departed just before a federal investigation into accounting irregularities began. I had conducted my due diligence, of course. It was my job to be thorough. When I raised my concerns with the board, they dismissed them as typical resistance to change. "Jason brings exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need," Board Chairman Robert Hayes told me during our quarterly meeting. "Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve extraordinary results." Those calculated risks began almost immediately. Jason started pushing for aggressive revenue targets that seemed disconnected from reality. He wanted to enter new markets without adequate research, sign contracts with vendors I had never vetted properly, and pursue partnerships that set off alarm bells in my compliance instincts. Every time I raised concerns, he would flash that patronizing smile and tell me I was being overly cautious. The breaking point arrived 3 weeks ago during our monthly executive meeting when Jason proposed backdating several vendor agreements to inflate our quarterly numbers. The room fell silent as he detailed his plan, all eyes eventually turning to me. I met his gaze and declared, "I cannot and will not sign off on any documentation that misrepresents our financial position." For just a moment, his mask slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath his charming facade. "Denise, I understand your concerns, but sometimes we need to think creatively about our reporting. This is standard practice in the industry." "No, Jason, it isn't," I replied firmly. "And even if it were, it would still be fraud." The tension in the room was palpable, with other executives shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly torn between supporting their new CEO and backing the woman who had kept the company out of legal trouble for over a decade. In the end, most remained quiet, revealing everything I needed to know about their loyalties. That night, I went home and began documenting everything. Every questionable decision, every inappropriate request, every corner Jason tried to cut. I photographed emails, copied files, and created a comprehensive record of his attempts to manipulate. Our financial reporting, call it professional paranoia or merely good sense, but I had learned long ago that when integrity was on the line, documentation was your best defense. My assistant, Catherine, noticed my late nights and weekend work sessions. "Is everything okay, Denise?" she asked last Friday as I locked yet another set of files in my office safe. Catherine had been with the company for 8 years and knew me well enough to recognize when something was seriously wrong. "Just being extra careful," I told her, which was both true and a significant understatement. The revelation that would change everything came the week before the launch event, hidden in a routine audit report that should have been straightforward. While reviewing our third quarter financials, I noticed discrepancies in several key accounts. Revenue numbers that didn't match our actual sales records, expenses that had been mysteriously reclassified, and vendor payments tied to contracts. I spent the entire weekend in my office cross-referencing documents and following paper trails. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Jason hadn't just been pushing aggressive accounting practices, he had been actively falsifying records. Revenue had been inflated by nearly 15% through a combination of backdated contracts and fictitious sales. Expenses had been manipulated to create the illusion of improved margins, and even our cash flow statements had been doctored. The audit firm we had worked with for years, McKenna and Associates, had already begun their preliminary review. I knew their senior partner, David McKenna, personally, and I trusted his integrity. When I called him Sunday evening to discuss my findings, his tone turned grave. "Denise, these numbers don't match what we've received," he said after I walked him through my discoveries. "If what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at systematic fraud." "That's exactly what we're looking at," I replied. "The question is, what do we do about it?" David paused for a long moment. "We need to halt the audit immediately until these discrepancies can be resolved. I cannot sign off on financial statements that I know to be fraudulent." Monday morning, I requested an emergency meeting with Jason. I walked into his office with a copy of the preliminary audit findings and my own documentation of the irregularities. His reaction was not what I anticipated. Instead of denial or anger, Jason leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Denise, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. These are simply different ways of presenting the same information. Nothing we're doing is technically illegal." "Jason, this is fraud," I stated, placing the documents on his desk. "We cannot present these numbers to investors or the board. I won't sign off on them." His smile never faltered. "Then perhaps it's time we discussed your future with this company." The threat was unmistakable, but I stood my ground. "Are you asking me to certify false financial statements?" "I'm asking you to be a team player." I gathered my documents and replied, "Then I guess we have a problem." That conversation sealed my fate, but also solidified my resolve. Jason could fire me, humiliate me, even destroy my reputation, but he could not force me to compromise my integrity. As I prepared for what I knew would be my final week at Virepoint Dynamics, I ensured every piece of evidence was meticulously preserved and organized. If Jason wanted to play hardball, I would be ready. The launch event would be the perfect stage for the truth to finally surface. The evening of the launch event arrived with all the pomp Jason had envisioned. The ballroom at the Everhart Hotel was adorned with Virepoint's corporate colors, and servers moved through the crowd with expensive wine and catered appetizers. Industry journalists mingled with potential investors, board members, and key clients. Exactly the type of high-profile gathering where Jason thrived. I arrived fashionably late, dressed in my best black suit and carrying the folder that would change everything. Catherine had offered to accompany me for moral support, but I declined. This was something I needed to handle alone. As I entered the ballroom, I spotted Jason near the stage, surrounded by admirers and holding court as the consummate showman. The presentation began promptly at 7 p.m. Jason took the stage with practiced confidence, his smile bright enough to illuminate the entire hotel. He spoke passionately about innovation, market disruption, and Virepoint's promising future. The audience was captivated, hanging on his every word as he painted a picture of extraordinary growth and profitability. Our third quarter results exceeded all expectations, he announced, gesturing toward the large screen displaying our purported stellar financial performance. Revenue is up 18% year over year, and our profit margins have improved significantly due to strategic operational enhancements. I felt my stomach churn as I watched him present the fraudulent figures with such conviction. Several investors in the audience nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by what they believed was outstanding financial health. Board Chairman Robert Hayes beamed from his front row seat, obviously pleased with his choice of CEO. Jason continued his presentation, outlining ambitious expansion plans and projected growth targets built entirely on the falsified financial framework he had established. "We're not just growing," he proclaimed. "We're revolutionizing how this industry thinks about efficiency and profitability." Then came the moment I had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. Jason's expression turned serious as he prepared to address what he termed necessary organizational changes. "Success requires difficult decisions," he began, his voice adopting a more somber tone. "To achieve the results you see today, we had to eliminate inefficiencies and remove obstacles to progress. Sometimes that means parting ways with employees who resist change or cannot adapt to new methodologies." The audience listened intently, clearly buying into his narrative of tough but necessary leadership choices. I could see several investors nodding in understanding, accepting the premise that successful companies sometimes had to make hard personnel decisions. "We succeeded by cutting out the useless employees who held us back," Jason declared with renewed energy, his smile returning. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause, and I felt the weight of every gaze in the room. Some attendees knew precisely who he was referring to, and I could sense their stares burning into me. Security guards began filtering through the crowd, their destination unmistakably my table. Jason had orchestrated this moment flawlessly. Public humiliation followed by physical removal, all in front of the people whose opinions mattered most in our industry. It was a masterclass in character assassination. But as the guards approached, I stood up calmly and walked toward the stage. The crowd grew quiet, sensing something unexpected was occurring. Jason's smile faltered slightly as he noticed my movement, but quickly recovered, likely assuming I was about to make a desperate plea or emotional outburst. I ascended the steps to the stage with measured composure, clutching my black folder tightly. The ballroom fell completely silent, hundreds of eyes trained on the unfolding drama. Jason maintained his confident demeanor, extending his hand as if to shake mine in a gracious farewell gesture. Instead, I handed him the folder. "Congratulations on your success," I said, my voice clear and carrying throughout the silent room. My tone was perfectly cordial, even warm, which seemed to catch him off guard. Without another word, I turned and exited the stage, walking through the crowd and out of the ballroom. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of confused voices as Jason opened the folder that would dismantle everything he had built. The folder contained everything. 14 pages of meticulously documented evidence that would unravel Jason's carefully constructed web of deception. As I drove home through the streets of Portland, I imagined him opening that black cover and seeing the first page, a cover letter from McKenna and Associates stating their refusal to certify our financial statements, pending resolution of significant irregularities in reported revenue and expense allocations. The second section included printouts of the original sales records alongside the doctored versions Jason had submitted for the quarterly reports, side-by-side comparisons that made the inflation impossible to deny. Revenue had been artificially boosted through backdated contracts with vendors who had confirmed in writing that they never agreed to the terms being reported. Page 7 detailed the expense reclassifications used to enhance our apparent profit margins, legitimate operational costs that had been shifted to different categories or written off entirely to create the illusion of efficiency improvements. Every manipulation was highlighted and cross-referenced with the original documentation. The most damaging section came toward the end. Email printouts revealing Jason's own words, demanding that accounting staff find creative solutions to revenue shortfalls and instructing department heads to think outside the box when reporting expenses. His digital trail of pressure and intimidation preserved in black and white. The final pages contain statements from 3 key vendors contacted by Jason's team regarding backdating agreements. All 3 had refused and provided written documentation of those requests. One even indicated they were considering ending their relationship with VirePoint due to what they perceived as unethical business practices. By the time I reached my house in the suburbs, my phone was already ringing. Catherine's number appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Then Robert Hayes called, followed by 2 board members I recognized. Each call went unanswered as I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my living room, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just transpired. The evening news was already running a story about disruption at a major Portland manufacturing company's launch event. While they didn't have specifics, they reported that several high-profile investors left abruptly after an unexpected interruption. One reporter mentioned that sources at the scene described what appeared to be a significant document exchange that caused visible distress among attendees. My phone buzzed with a text from David McKenna. "Saw the news. Are you okay?" I simply replied, "Yes, the right thing was done." Catherine tried calling again, and this time I answered. "Denise, what happened?" "The whole place went crazy after you left. Jason looked like he'd seen a ghost, and then investors started leaving in groups. Is everything okay?" "Everything is exactly as it should be," I told her. Jason finally got to see the real financial picture instead of the fiction he'd been presenting. "What do you mean?" "You'll probably want to start looking for another position. Virepoint is going to face some serious challenges in the coming weeks." There was silence on the other end as she processed what I was telling her. Catherine was smart enough to read between the lines. "Denise, what was in that folder?" "The truth," I replied simply. "Just the truth." After hanging up, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. For months, I had watched Jason manipulate numbers, pressure staff, and build his success on a foundation of lies. Tonight, that foundation crumbled in front of the very people he had been trying to impress. The applause that greeted his declaration about cutting useless employees would be the last celebration he would enjoy at Virepoint Dynamics. Wednesday morning brought the first wave of consequences. I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The Portland Business Journal had somehow obtained details about the launch event and published an article titled "Financial Questions Rock Virepoint Dynamics Following Executive Departure." While they were careful to avoid specific allegations, the implication was clear. Something significant had gone wrong. By 10 a.m., 3 major investors had formally requested emergency meetings with the board of directors. 2 others sent letters indicating their intention to reevaluate their investment positions pending clarification of recent financial disclosures. The domino effect I had anticipated was beginning in earnest. Catherine called just before noon, her voice tight with anxiety. "Denise, the office is chaos. Jason called an all-hands meeting this morning, but he looked terrible. He kept saying everything was under control, but nobody believed him." Then David McKenna showed up with 2 other auditors, and they've been locked in the conference room with Jason and Robert Hayes for hours. "What about staff morale?" I asked, genuinely concerned for my former colleagues. "People are scared. There are rumors about layoffs and the company being in financial trouble. Some are saying you were right all along about Jason, that he was cooking the books." The validation felt hollow. Being proven right about Jason's corruption brought no joy when it meant potential hardship for innocent employees trying to do their jobs. These were people I had worked alongside for years, professionals who deserved better than to have their careers disrupted by one man's greed and ambition. Thursday brought news that Jason had been placed on administrative leave pending a comprehensive audit. The announcement came through a press release that cited ongoing financial review processes and the need for complete transparency during the evaluation period. Reading between the lines, it was clear the board was positioning itself to sever ties with Jason entirely. Friday afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Marcus Wright, CEO of Brightage Manufacturing, one of Virepoint's primary competitors. I had known Marcus professionally for several years through industry events and respected his reputation for ethical leadership. "Denise, I heard about the situation at Virepoint," he said without preamble. "I also heard that you were the one who exposed whatever was going on over there." "Word travels fast in our industry," I replied cautiously. "It does when someone shows real courage. Listen, I know this probably isn't the best timing, but I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you. We're looking for someone to head our financial operations, someone with unquestionable integrity and deep industry experience." The offer took me by surprise. In my focus on doing the right thing at Virepoint, I hadn't considered what would come next for my career. The idea of joining a competitor, particularly one with Brightage's stellar reputation, was intriguing. I appreciate the interest, Marcus, but I should probably let things settle down before making any major decisions. Of course, Denise. What you did took real guts. The whole industry is talking about it. Many people respect what you stood up for. After hanging up, I realized that my professional reputation, which I had worried might be tarnished by the confrontation with Jason, was actually being enhanced. The industry was recognizing my actions not as corporate disloyalty, but as professional integrity. Other executives were viewing what occurred at Virepoint as a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical leadership. The following week brought even more dramatic developments, but for now, I allowed myself to feel cautiously optimistic about both the immediate ramifications of my actions and the longer-term possibilities for my career. The final blow came exactly 1 week after the launch event, delivered with the cold precision of a federal investigation. I was having coffee at my kitchen table when Catherine called with news that would permanently end Jason's career. "Denise, the FBI is here," she whispered into the phone. "They arrived about an hour ago with warrants. They're seizing computers, files, everything. Jason was arrested at his house this morning." The speed of the investigation surprised even me. Apparently, one of the investors who had left the launch event had contacts within the Securities and Exchange Commission. The folder I had handed Jason hadn't just exposed him to our board and investors, it had triggered a federal investigation into securities fraud. "What about the staff?" I asked, my concern for my former colleagues overriding any satisfaction I might have felt about Jason's arrest. "Most people are being sent home while they complete the seizure. Human Resources is telling everyone that the company will continue operating, but honestly, nobody knows what's going to happen." The afternoon news confirmed what Catherine had told me and more. Jason had been charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to manipulate financial records. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. Virepoint's stock, which had been trading at record highs just days earlier, had been suspended pending the investigation. By evening, the story reached national business news. CNBC aired a segment about corporate fraud in mid-sized manufacturing companies, using Virepoint as a case study to illustrate how quickly fraudulent accounting practices could unravel. The reporter noted that the investigation had been triggered by whistleblower evidence provided by a former executive with intimate knowledge of the company's financial practices. Robert Hayes resigned from the board that same day, along with 2 other directors who had played key roles in hiring Jason. The remaining board members appointed an interim CEO and announced their intention to cooperate fully with federal investigators. They also issued a public statement acknowledging that serious financial irregularities had been discovered and promising full transparency throughout the investigation. The irony was not lost on me. Jason had labeled me a useless employee who held the company back. In reality, I had been the only thing standing between Virepoint and complete destruction. My refusal to certify fraudulent financial statements hadn't just protected my integrity, it had saved the company from even deeper legal troubles. 3 months later, I found myself sitting in the executive conference room at Brightage Manufacturing, reviewing quarterly reports as their new chief financial officer. Marcus Wright had renewed his offer after the dust settled at Virepoint, and I accepted, drawn by his commitment to ethical leadership and transparent operations. The transition had been remarkably smooth. Brightage's financial systems were exactly what I had hoped to find, meticulously maintained, fully compliant, and refreshingly straightforward. After years of battling Jason's attempts to manipulate our numbers, working with clean books felt like a relief I hadn't realized I needed. Virepoint had survived, though barely. The interim CEO managed to steady the company by implementing aggressive cost-cutting measures and completely overhauling their financial reporting systems. They also hired McKenna and Associates to conduct a comprehensive audit and implement new oversight procedures. Catherine stayed on as part of the skeleton crew working to rebuild the company's reputation and operations. Jason's trial was scheduled for the following year, but his legal team had already indicated they were seeking a plea agreement. Industry analysts estimated that his fraud had cost investors over $12 million in inflated valuations and false projections. Several civil lawsuits had been filed by pension funds and individual investors who had made decisions based on the fraudulent financial statements. The case had become a talking point throughout our industry about the importance of financial oversight and the courage required to speak truth to power. I had been invited to speak at 3 conferences about corporate governance and ethical leadership, though I declined all requests. I preferred to let my actions speak for themselves. As I reviewed Brightedge's impeccable financial records, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that night at the Everhart Hotel. Sometimes, doing the right thing came with a cost, but it often led to opportunities better than anything you could imagine. My phone buzzed with a text from David McKenna. Saw the Brightedge announcement. Congratulations on the new position. The industry is lucky to have someone with your integrity in a leadership role. Looking back on the path that had brought me here, I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that sometimes justice and professional success could align perfectly.